Hey everybody, welcome back to another history lesson with Mr. Bennett. Today we're continuing where we left off with lesson 4 of chapter 15, Crisis and Resurgence, talking a little bit more about Ronald Reagan, specifically focusing on his foreign policy in the end of the Cold War and at the very tail end, touching a little bit on pop culture and some of the bigger movements that happened throughout the 80s. So let's go ahead and jump right on into it. So let's talk about how we had to rebuild our image following the damage done by both Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter, right? They ruined all of our foreign influence throughout both of their presidencies. And here in the top right-hand corner, we see the kind of mantra that Reagan was pushing throughout the 80s, peace through strength. And if you look at that picture, you can see that it's made up of a peace sign with lots of guns and ammunition and missiles and helicopters and planes and tanks. The idea here was that the best offense was a good offense, right? The idea that if you've got a lot of guns and a huge military, nobody's going to want to mess with you, right? That it will deter further military action. But let's talk about some of the things that led us into that ideology. So let's talk about some major failures in American history when it came to foreign policy and foreign affairs. One, Vietnam, right? We had this horrible blunder of a war that no president wanted to be responsible for losing. The Watergate scandal under Richard Nixon damaged the credibility of the federal government, particularly the office of the presidency. Nobody had faith or confidence in the U.S. government anymore. The Iranian hostage crisis under Jimmy Carter really almost single-handedly cost him his re-election bid. And so let's talk about how Reagan responds to that, right? This evolution of foreign policy known as the Reagan Doctrine. That idea of peace through strength. So in 1983, you've got this country, Grenada, a small Caribbean island. So you have a communist takeover of the island. And so Reagan sends in the Marines because, of course, we do not like communism, right? That concept of the Red Scare is still alive and well in the American mind. And so Reagan promises to go beyond containment in Grenada and says he has to roll back communism, right? You have to fight them and drive them back, essentially making communists afraid of America. And so what we do is we give aid, both monetary and militarily, to these freedom fighters, both in Grenada and throughout the world, particularly in Afghanistan, which will end up biting us in the butt in the 2000s, Angola, Nicaragua, and Cambodia, all these anti-communist freedom fighters. So this peace through strength policy manifests itself really as an evolution of that Machiavellian mantra statement that let he who desires peace prepare for war. As long as you're prepared for war, people will be more hesitant to fight you. So you deter war by showing the means and will for war. You show people that you're willing to fight and that you're capable, and then they will leave you largely alone. So we increased military spending in the gajillions, right? I don't have any raw numbers in front of me. We spent a lot more in the military, so much so that this military spending in the 80s really carries us through the 90s up into the 2000s when 9/11 ramps up. And he attempts to pass something known as Star Wars, right? Literally gives it a pop culture name, referencing the movie series, right, of the 80s, which was essentially going to be like a laser-guided missile defense system to stop and intercept any missiles that would be launched at the United States. Because at this point, we're becoming more and more concerned about ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, reaching the United States. So let's talk a little bit about terrorism, particularly that guy on the right, Muammar Gaddafi. So terrorism, for those of you that don't know, let's give a broad definition for how we're going to address it in this class. So terrorism is the use of violence and intimidation, or intimidation, in the pursuit of political aims or goals, usually by non-state organizations, right? These are not countries. These are individuals, typically organizations that are not usually affiliated with a state. You can have state-sponsored terrorism, but it's not us versus a country. It's us versus a group of people with an ideology. So in 1982, the Israelis invade Lebanon, a neighboring country, with the goal of kind of easing the tensions there between Christians and Palestinian refugees. Again, the Palestinians, predominantly Muslim, do not like the majority Jewish people in Israel, who have kind of allied themselves with the Christians, long story. And so Lebanon says, look, we want U.S. and French aid. We should know that that's already problematic because we're allied with the Israelis. And so a suicide bomber then attacks a joint American-French barrack in Beirut, the capital of Lebanon. So You have Lebanese terrorists attacking Americans in Lebanon as a result of the Israelis invading Lebanon. Total, you have 241 U.S. Marines dead, 58 paratroopers from France are killed, and Reagan immediately pulls out. He says, look, we're not going to be there. We're not going to deal with it. We don't want to be entangled with this anymore. So Reagan at that point says, look, we're not going to negotiate with terrorists. We only negotiate with official states, with countries. In response, we bombed 2 Libyan cities in 1986. This guy, Muammar Gaddafi, is the dictator of Libya. So Muammar Gaddafi was the guy that supported these terrorists as well as other terrorists, right? He looks like a cartoon supervillain, and he kind of is. Then later, in 1988, a couple years later, Libya claims responsibility for blowing up a Pan Am flight over Scotland. So you have this plane go down over Scotland. The Libyans take credit for it. So now you have essentially state-sponsored terrorism. All right, now this is the big one. This is one of the bigger blunders of Ronald Reagan's presidency, the Iran-Contra affair in 1986. So the reality was that even though Reagan said he wasn't going to negotiate with terrorists, they most assuredly did. They did negotiate with terrorists secretly, selling arms to Iran. So these Lebanese terrorists then released American hostages after we sell arms to Iran. So the idea was, right, we work out a deal with Iran in exchange for the Lebanese terrorists releasing American hostages. Then the money from that sale to Iran is given not directly to us, but to anti-communist Contras, meaning they're going against the communists in Nicaragua. So we sell guns to Iran, say we don't want the money, you give the money so that we don't get tied up in this, to the anti-communist Contra groups in Nicaragua. In exchange for that, the Lebanese then release the American hostages. There's a lot of moving pieces, hopefully you're seeing. Because Congress had previously banned U.S. aid to the Contras. We didn't want to get embroiled in that. So eventually the American public finds out. They're super chapped for us supporting Iran, because at that point they are not our enemies, but we're not on the best of terms with them. And mostly because they have been a sponsor of terrorism. So Reagan ends up getting away scot-free. But a bunch of officials under him get caught lying to Congress, and a bunch of them go to prison. And at that point, we can turn our attention to this cartoon on the top right. So we've got the Lincoln Memorial, beautiful pillars, Jefferson Memorial, similar thing. And then you have the Reagan Memorial, and it's labeled Federal Prison for Former Reagan Administration Officials Facility. Tons of people went to prison that had worked for Reagan as a result of the Iran-Contra affair. And so this, again, really, really reduces the credibility of the American government. We'd said we weren't going to do something, then we go and do it, and we lie about it, and we get caught. All right, let's talk about the end of the Cold War. So, during Reagan's second term, we see a bunch of dictatorships just gradually kind of collapse, like a flan in a cupboard, right? They start disappearing throughout Latin America and in the Philippines. And this guy, Mikhail Gorbachev, becomes head of the Soviet Communist Party in 1985. He ultimately is going to work to kind of bring reforms and, again, an end to the Soviet system gradually, piece by piece. He sees that this Soviet communism isn't working, and he slowly puts things in place, step by step, to dismantle it and introduce capitalism to Russia. At the same time, he pulls troops out of Afghanistan. So Gorbachev meets with Reagan. They both agree to dismantle thousands of nuclear missiles. So going back to that idea of working with the Russians to de-escalate the Cold War, right? Just like Nixon had done. So Reagan gives this famous speech referencing the Berlin Wall, and he says, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." And ultimately, right, within a couple of years, they do. In 1989, the year of my birth, woo! So they tear the Berlin Wall down in 1989, which is really symbolizing the end of the Soviet Union and the USSR. MTV goes there, right? That exists at that point now. And they have a huge party, and there's all these celebrities and musical artists, and David Hasselhoff is like singing and dancing on top of the Berlin Wall. It was majestic, and people were taking sledgehammers to it and keeping pieces of it. And so it's a symbolic end to the Cold War. Now, the reality was that Reagan didn't play a huge hand in this. He was involved, but it was really Mikhail Gorbachev that did most of the footwork. Reagan just had to be the right guy in the right place at the right time. So this makes him look really popular. All right, and then let's wrap up by talking a little bit about 1980s culture. So in the early 1980s, we see the introduction of music television, MTV, and it used to literally just show, for the most part, music videos, which was a new thing because now you could see what the musicians and artists actually looked like. On the top right, if you check out the slides, you can see the first music video ever aired on MTV. Video killed the radio star. On the bottom right there, you see Donkey Kong and Mario and Pac-Man video games have a resurgence in the 80s. You saw a lot of arcades in the 70s and early 80s. Then it kind of dies out. That's a story unto itself. But then when home consoles get introduced in the mid to late 80s, video games become much more popular again. So throughout the 80s, you see the rise of what are known as young urban professionals, typically young white men, business suits, graduated from business school, going and getting involved in the financial industry, and these are known as yuppies, right? YUP, young urban professionals. You have what is known as the retail revolution, which is when you have all these big name, big box stores, the Targets, the Walmarts, the Sears, the JCPenney's, Circuit City, which is again no longer around. A lot of the businesses from the 80s have recently kind of died out. So Walmart gets founded in 1980, Home Depot is founded in the 80s, Best Buy is founded in the 80s, and then when it comes to media, you see television become more prevalent than ever before. We move away from satellite television to cable television, so most houses now have access to basic cable. You see the rise, or the introduction really, of BET, Black Entertainment Television, which allows Robert Johnson to become the first black man to make $1 billion, a billionaire. MTV we talked a little bit about. You see the portability of music become prevalent as well with the cassette tape and the Walkman from Sony. Previously, you might have had an 8-track player in your car or a record player. CDs were just prohibitively expensive. Nobody really had a CD player quite yet. And VCRs allowed people to now watch movies in their homes, right? Previously, you had to have like a tape-to-tape reel. You might have Betamax or something, but VCRs become standard in the American household. And video games, which we talked about briefly already. The global positioning system becomes available to the public after previously only being available to the government through NASA. And then finally, Reagan declares essentially a war on drugs. This is where that idea of DARE comes from, right? They start kind of demonizing drugs, and they increase the penalties for having or selling drugs, particularly marijuana. They also start focusing on crime, and they start having worse punishments for smaller offenses and smaller offenders. Throughout the 80s, you also have the AIDS crisis, which is the autoimmune deficiency syndrome, which is the resulting disease of the HIV virus, the human immunodeficiency virus, which predominantly affected the gay community, the LGBTQIA plus community, particularly men, and drug users, intravenous drug users. And then finally, to combat some of these things, particularly the AIDS crisis, you see what is known as rock and roll activism. And not just with AIDS, right? They wanted to raise awareness and raise money to help fight AIDS, to help fight hunger and poverty and crime. And so you have things like Band Aid, Live Aid, Farm Aid to help farmers throughout the world. And so you have these huge concerts and festivals where some of the proceeds are going to benefit these places. So you see a more public awareness of problems and people using their money to support these problems. And again, they can only do that because the economy is finally starting to recover from the 1970s. So let's go ahead and jump on into the quiz. So just a couple of questions. Question 1. How did President Ronald Reagan's administration support Contra rebels in Nicaragua after Congress cut funding for military aid? Was it A, by secretly selling weapons to Iran in order to raise funds? B, by confiscating funds seized in drug raids? C, by implementing a sin tax on luxury items? Or D, by collecting tariffs on oil imports from Saudi Arabia? Take a couple of seconds, pause the video if you need to. How did we support the anti-communist rebels? And it was by A, secretly selling weapons to Iran in order to raise funds. Question 2. In this excerpt, Reagan is referring to what would become known as what? So we have President Ronald Reagan addressing the nation March 4th, 1987. A few months ago, I told the American people I did not trade arms for hostages. My heart and my best intentions still tell me that's true, but the facts and evidence tell me it is not. So he's referencing what? Is it F, the Iran-Contra affair? G, the Watergate scandal, H, the Plame affair, or J, the Whitewater controversy? Yeah, that's a gimme. The answer is F, the Iran-Contra affair. Question 3, which speaker would most likely agree with President Ronald Reagan's national security policy? So think about what Reagan did in terms of national security. Speaker 1, a continuing proliferation of weapons will result in global war. Proliferation meaning making more, right? Increasing the amount of weapons. Speaker 2, conventional arms are more important than advanced technology. Conventional arms being guns, missiles, tanks, advanced technology, laser-guided missiles, and things like that. Speaker 3, the military draft is essential for combat preparedness. Or Speaker 4, increased defensive strength will discourage aggression by others. So which of these things would have aligned with Reagan's concept of peace through strength? Which of these is the definition of the Reagan doctrine? Is it F, Speaker 1, G, Speaker 2, H, Speaker 3, or J, Speaker 4? That's right. The answer is J, Speaker 4. All right, and the last little question for today that we can go back and give you the answers to in the next lesson. Question 4, what did President Reagan say he wanted to happen in Europe? And explain his statement. So this is in June 1987, Reagan gave a speech near the Berlin Wall. Many saw this address as the beginning of the end of the Cold War and the fall of communism. So the quote is, "We hear much from Moscow about a new policy of reform and openness. Some political prisoners have been released. Certain foreign news broadcasts are no longer being jammed. Some economic enterprises have been permitted to operate with greater freedom. Are these the beginnings of profound changes in the Soviet state? Or are they token gestures intended to raise false hopes in the West? We welcome change and openness, for we believe that freedom and security go together. There is one sign that the Soviets can make that would be unmistakable and advance the cause of freedom and peace. General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, come here to this gate, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." So what is Reagan saying he wants to happen in Europe? What is he looking for? What is he hoping for? What ultimately happens, right, in 1989 and ultimately wraps up in 1991 officially? What happens regarding Mr. Gorbachev and communism and the Cold War? So hopefully you'll have that answer. Post it in the comments. Let me know what you think, and I'll catch you guys on the flip side.